I was at a tech summit last week, and I ended up sitting here across from this guy who had just finished a deep dive into what he called ancestral coding.
Oh, wow. Ancestral coding.
Yeah, right. And he was leaning back, just radiating this sort of, I don't know, smug primal confidence.
I can picture it.
And he was explaining why he just passed on a major investment, but he didn't talk about market volatility or, neural network ethics or anything like that.
Let me guess, he brought it back to biology.
Exactly. He actually tapped his temple and told me his Pleistocene brain had sensed a lack of tribal cohesion in the founder's eyes.
Oh, boy. Tribal cohesion.
Yeah. He was totally convinced that his internal software, which he said was honed over 100,000 years on the savannah, was like a more reliable guide than any 2026 data stream.
Right, because obviously venture capital is just like hunting mammoths.
That was his exact vibe. To him, every modern interaction was just this thin veneer over a set of biological truths, and he acted like he alone had the alpha clarity to see it.
The alpha clarity, that is a very specific type of framing.
It really is. But then the conversation shifted to his personal life. He mentioned he'd recently stopped speaking to his sister.
Wait, really? Why?
Because she challenged his new philosophy.
Yeah.
And suddenly, this whole calm hunter persona just vanished.
Oh, I bet.
He got visibly agitated. I mean, his face was flushing as he described her skepticism. And he didn't see it as a rational disagreement. He called it a maladaptive betrayal.
A maladaptive betrayal? That is wild.
Yeah, and he dropped this bizarre line about how in a real tribe, she would have been cast out for weakening the collective.
Wow.
Just one mention of a conflicting viewpoint, and the guy who was praising his evolved instincts was suddenly just vibrating with this very modern, very unexamined rage.
Right, his ego was bruised.
Totally, that sudden snap, from a man praising his superior biological hardware to a man throwing a tantrum because his sister punctured his ego. Yeah. It was just jarring.
Yeah, because it wasn't really ancestral wisdom at all.
Exactly. It was a sophisticated intellectual trap. He was using evolutionary psychology not to understand the world, but, well, to build a fortress around his own confirmation biases.
That is such a classic trap.
It really made me wonder, for all of you listening, in an age of hypercomplexity and metacognition, are we actually savages in suits? Or have we just become experts at inventing just-so stories to avoid the uncomfortable reality of our own mental filters?
I mean, that tendency to observe a modern behavior and then just retroactively invent some survival-based justification for it, that is one of the most pervasive intellectual traps in behavioral science right now.
It's basically a defense mechanism.
It's a mechanism of deflection. And to really dissect how deeply entrenched this habit is, we kind of have to examine the historical bedrock where a lot of these theories were first formalized.
Which takes us to a very specific quiet moment in 1984.
Right.
I want to set the scene here. Dr. Julian Vane is sitting alone in a windowless observation room at this sprawling Midwestern university.
Just a classic sterile academic setting.
Exactly. The air is stale. It smells faintly of this lukewarm, bitter coffee he's nursing. Yeah. And through a two-way mirror, he is meticulously observing male undergraduates interacting with female counterparts.
And he's looking for something very specific. He
is entirely convinced he is recording a fundamental, inescapable biological truth. He thinks he's proving that men are evolutionarily primed to overperceive sexual intent in women's smiles and casual gestures.
Right, the old hardwired bias theory.
Right. For weeks, he watches these young men consistently misinterpret simple, polite engagement as an overt invitation to mate. So he has his data.
Or so he thinks.
Yeah. He has this massive, elegant, just-so story perfectly packaged to explain that this is a reproductive survival mechanism. And he is totally ready to submit it to the premier academic journals.
Yeah, he was preparing to formalize what evolutionary psychologists call the sexual overperception bias.
But then, almost as an afterthought, like a final check on his own rigorousness, Vane decides to run a control group.
Which is where everything falls apart for him.
Exactly. He makes this highly subtle shift in linguistic framing. Instead of handing the male subjects a questionnaire asking them to rate the woman's attraction or desire, he changes the vocabulary.
He asks about professional courtesy instead, right?
Yes. He asks them to evaluate her level of professional courtesy and conversational politeness. He uses the exact social scripts that were common to 1980s suburban American culture.
And that single, seemingly minor methodological adjustment, it completely destabilizes his entire biological premise.
The hardwired bias just vanishes. I mean, the data comes back completely flat. the ancient biological signal vein was so certain he had discovered was, well, in reality, nothing more than a reflection of the gendered conversational norms of that specific decade.
In that specific geography.
Exactly. So he's sitting there tasting the dregs of that bitter coffee, and he's just engulfed by this wave of profound embarrassment. He wasn't documenting an instinct forged on the Pleistocene savanna at all.
He was documenting the invisible, socially constructed walls of his own immediate culture.
Right. The hardwired theory was merely a convenient narrative. It completely ignored the immense complexity of human language and social conditioning.
That moment in the observation room is like a perfect encapsulation of the methodological flaw that has propped up these deterministic frameworks for decades.
So how did they get it so wrong for so long?
Well, to dismantle this, we really must examine the signal detection paradigm that those early researchers used. The prevailing scientific consensus at the time argued that men faced significantly lower mandatory reproductive costs compared to women.
Because of pregnancy and rearing.
Right. Therefore, the theory claimed, men evolved a specialized heuristic to overperceive sexual interest. The evolutionary logic dictated that it was mathematically advantageous to assume a female was interested and be wrong, rather than assume she was not interested and miss a critical opportunity to pass on genes.
It was heavily framed as an error management strategy, basically the biological equivalent of a smoke detector being way too sensitive.
That is the exact analogy they used. A smoke detector is calibrated to issue false alarms because, the cost of a false positive waking up to burnt toast is totally negligible compared to the cost of a false negative.
Which is the house burning down.
Exactly. So the researchers applied this directly to male mating psychology. However, scrutinizing the methodology of those foundational studies reveals this massive structural asymmetry in how the data was gathered.
The tests themselves were rigged by the language on the page.
Rigged is the accurate term here, whether the researchers intended it or not. The primary materials used to test this theory were written vignettes.
Like little short stories they'd read.
Right. And when a vignette was constructed for a male participant to evaluate a woman's behavior, the descriptions frequently leaned heavily toward the explicitly sexual or deeply intimate, even when the researchers formally categorized the vignette as neutral.
Wow.
Conversely, the vignettes presented to female participants describing male behavior were systematically shrouded in ambiguity and platitudes. So the measuring instrument itself was severely distorted.
I want to break down the mechanics of that distortion. Because how does a modern researcher actually correct for a flawed textual baseline from the 1980s?
That's where we look at the rigorous 2021 research published by Brandner and colleagues. They recognized this historical asymmetry and decided to strictly control for the linguistic nuances.
They leveled the playing field.
They did. They applied a highly disciplined signal detection framework that mathematically accounted for the perceiver's baseline sensitivity. And they standardized the language across all genders and scenarios.
And when you remove that loaded language, what happens to the biological smoke detector?
It completely ceases to go off. The data demonstrates that when the linguistic framing is neutralized, the sex-specific bias essentially evaporates.
That's incredible.
Yeah. In fact, the findings indicate that both men and women display an overall underperception of sexual interest, or at least a highly calibrated, accurate perception.
So there is no empirical evidence of a hardwired, universal male overperception running constantly in the background.
Right. It is a severe misinterpretation of the data. Often, what researchers mistakenly categorize as an evolutionary adaptation is actually a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as functional projection.
Okay, let's unpack functional projection. How does that operate mechanically in the brain?
So functional projection occurs when a perceiver projects their own immediate internal goals onto an ambiguous external target.
So it's about what they want, not what they're seeing.
It is not an ancient heuristic scanning the environment. It is a highly localized, state-dependent mechanism. If an individual, and this is regardless of sex, enters an interaction with a strong, active mating motive, they will functionally project that interest onto the person they are speaking with.
Just to facilitate their own objective.
Right. They interpret the ambiguous data to align with their internal state. It is an internal feedback loop, not an evolutionary adaptation fixed in the species hardware.
That reframes the entire interaction. It places the origin of the bias entirely in the present moment, based on the individual's current psychological state, rather than blaming it on, a prehistoric imperative.
It does.
But this brings up a secondary defense often used in evolutionary psychology. What about the sister effect?
The sister effect.
Yeah. Because the prevailing theory states that men who grow up with sisters are demonstrably less likely to overperceive sexual interest. And the evolutionary explanation I've heard is that growing up with a female sibling forces a biological reproductive cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
The brother becomes implicitly aware of the heavy social and biological costs females bear, and so his evolutionary hardware adjusts his perception accordingly.
The sister effect argument is perhaps the ultimate manifestation of the Just So story. I mean, it attempts to reduce an incredibly dense, nuanced sibling dynamic to a cold biological calculus.
What's it missing?
What that theory completely ignores is the principle of radical plasticity.
Which is the brain's ability to rewire itself based on its environment, right?
Correct. Growing up in a household with a sister is not a background biological variable. It is a profound, daily social immersion.
It's real life.
It is thousands of hours of forced perspective taking. A sibling learns the deep, granular nuances of non-sexual social cues, emotional labor, and empathy. The brain's neural pathways for social perception are physically wired by this continuous environmental feedback.
And that intense social learning completely overrides any theoretical reproductive calculus.
Absolutely. Human cognition is remarkably plastic. Our immediate social context and learned experiences shape our perceptual frameworks far more aggressively than some inflexible, ancient reproductive algorithm.
To use a mechanical metaphor, it's like the evolutionary argument is testing a highly sensitive directional microphone, but deciding to only ever speak into the left channel. Right? And after a year of doing this, you write a definitive paper concluding that the microphone was biologically designed by its manufacturer to only capture sound from the left side. You are entirely ignoring the environment you constructed around the instrument. So if we accept that these retroactive justifications are flawed, we have to look at the collateral damage they cause.
The danger of these frameworks is really significant. When a transient cultural norm like the gendered conversational scripts of 1980s suburbia is mislabeled as an immovable biological imperative, the societal attempt to address or critique or change that norm often just grinds to a halt.
Because people think, well, why fight biology?
Right. The false belief that a behavior is a permanent fixture of human hardware acts as an intellectual sedative.
It provides permission for intellectual and moral stagnation. If society accepts that certain behaviors are just the unstoppable echoes of the Pleistocene, we stop asking how we might engineer better social environments.
Exactly. It halts scientific inquiry because the conclusion is predetermined by the premise. But human beings are not simply passive recipients of biological directives.
We can push back.
We possess the unique architectural capacity to observe our own programming and, crucially, to decide against it.
Which transitions us to a completely different manifestation of our relationship with our biology. Because sometimes the most defining human actions are the ones that actively, violently oppose our evolutionary directives.
And doing so carries immeasurable physical weight.
Let's look at the spring of 1968. Imagine a crowded, dimly lit hall in London. We find Evelyn, a 26-year-old woman, standing near the back. She's tightly clutching a pamphlet for the newly formed Zero Population Movement. Her hands are visibly shaking. The paper is covered in stark diagrams predicting a future defined by exponential overpopulation, resource depletion, and global starvation.
A very real anxiety at that time.
Yeah. And as she reads, every biological impulse she possesses, the deeply ingrained drive for reproductive success, the imperative to propagate her genetic material, is colliding violently against the cold, ethical calculus forming in her prefrontal cortex. She is experiencing a sharp, localized physical friction.
She is standing at the exact intersection of evolutionary hardware and metacognitive intervention.
Later that night, sitting in the absolute quiet of her small apartment, the silence feels heavy, almost suffocating. She makes the final decision to never have children based on the ethical arguments in that pamphlet.
That's a massive choice.
And in that moment, she feels a profound sense of unnaturalness. It manifests as a raw, jagged loneliness in her chest. But looking at the mechanics of the mind, this isn't a biological failure or a psychological malfunction.
No.
It is a radical, deliberate act of will. She is executing a metacognitive override. She's choosing to defy the fundamental logic of the gene, carrying the terrifying weight of becoming a biological dead end, all for the sake of an abstract, future-oriented ethical belief.
The physical friction Evelyn experiences in that apartment is not merely a poetic metaphor for a difficult choice. It is a quantifiable thermodynamic reality.
Thermodynamic reality, hence.
To understand the mechanics of what is happening inside her nervous system, we have to examine a conceptual model from computational neuroscience. It's known as the Body Reservoir Governance Framework, or BRG.
Okay, let's break down the architecture of this body reservoir governance. How does this model map the human decision-making process?
The BRG framework posits that human agency operates across three distinct interacting layers. Layer 1 is designated as the body reservoir.
The body is right.
Yeah. It is mathematically modeled as a high-dimensional dynamical system, specifically an echo-state network. You can visualize it as a vast implicit ledger that continuously integrates the entire physiological and emotional history of your interactions with the environment. It is the seat of habituation and instinct.
So it's like the gut feeling layer.
Exactly. When layer 1 operates autonomously, without interference, it is functioning at a governance parameter we denote as an alpha of 1. At alpha equals 1, your actions are the fluid, self-consistent expression of your adapted bodily state.
So layer 1 is the ultimate biological autopilot. It doesn't analyze. It simply produces the response it has been trained by evolution and repetition to produce.
It is highly efficient and requires very little metabolic energy. It's cheap to run. Layer 2, conversely, is the cognitive filter.
And what does layer 2 do?
This is your sharp, precise, Turing-complete analytical engine. It allows you to execute exact conditional rules, parse complex logical arguments, and engage in abstract ethical reasoning.
Like reading a pamphlet on global overpopulation and projecting demographic trends 50 years into the future?
Exactly. However, layer 2 is incredibly expensive. It requires continuous, massive metabolic computation. To use it, you must actively observe the environment, classify the data, retrieve a specific ethical rule from memory, and forcefully execute it against the current physical state.
It is the heavy machinery of the brain.
Yeah.
So what governs when we use the autopilot versus the heavy machinery?
That is layer 3, which is metacognitive governance. Layer 3 does not perform the heavy analytical lifting. It functions as a lightweight policy governor that maintains one primary directive. Trust the body reservoir unless a severe anomaly is detected.
It's the man.
Yes. Layer 3 controls that alpha parameter. As long as the body is in a state of habituated comfort, metacognition keeps alpha near 1. The autopilot handles the navigation, but if the body encounters severe environmental friction, or if the cognitive filter flags a massive ethical contradiction, metacognition aggressively drops the alpha parameter towards 0.
And what happens at 0?
When alpha drops, the cognitive filter is forced to take manual control over the organism.
Okay, applying this back to Evelyn's apartment in 1968. Natural selection spent millions of years optimizing her layer 1 body reservoir to find reproductive success highly rewarding. The biological imperative is functioning perfectly.
Right.
But the modern ethical framework she observed earlier that day operates on a completely different timeline.
Exactly. Evolution operates on a timeline of millennia. The ethics of global resource management operate on a timeline of months or years. Evelyn uses her layer 3 metacognitive governance to forcefully push her alpha down to 0.
She flips the switch.
She activates her cognitive filter to completely override her habituated evolutionary baseline. And the critical insight from the BRG framework is that this override is not free. It incurs a literal thermodynamic cost.
We need to be very clear about what thermodynamic cost means in this context. Are we talking about a literal expenditure of physical energy?
Absolutely. In computational neuroscience, we measure this complexity cost using a metric called state space Kullback Leibler, or KL divergence.
Okay, let's slow down on KL divergence, because how does statistical distance physically manifest in the human brain?
Well, think of the body reservoir's natural habituated state as a highly specific probability distribution. Let's call it distribution Q.
Okay.
This is where the system naturally wants to rest. When Evelyn applies her cognitive filter to force a new behavior, refusing the reproductive drive, she is forcing her internal system into a completely different probability distribution P.
Right.
KL divergence measures the exact mathematical distance between where the system wants to be, which is Q, and where it is being forced to operate, which is P.
It's kind of like taking a thick, heavy rubber band that represents your biological baseline. When you decide to act against that baseline, you are physically stretching the rubber band. And the further you stretch it away from its resting state, the more tension builds up in the material.
That is an excellent mechanical metaphor. And maintaining that stretch requires constant, unyielding energy. The system is pushed far from equilibrium. That raw, jagged loneliness Evelyn experienced. That is the subjective psychological translation of that thermodynamic expense.
It's the friction.
It is the physical metabolic heat generated by the friction of acting against an adapted nature. The brain is quite literally burning resources to maintain the structural integrity of that cognitive override.
If defying our evolutionary programming generates that much internal friction and exhausts our metabolic resources, it explains a massive limitation in human behavior.
It does.
Does this thermodynamic cost explain why movements that demand continuous, massive cognitive override like extreme global altruism or strict antinatalism rarely scale to the level of the general population?
The BRG model indicates precisely that. Operating at an alpha of zero pure, unadulterated cognitive override is neurologically brittle and metabolically punishing.
It's exhausting.
The vast majority of the population simply cannot sustain that extreme state-space distortion indefinitely. The thermodynamic pressure eventually forces the system to snap back toward the habituated baseline because it is biologically cheaper to operate there.
The battery simply runs out.
Yes. However, this reality also highlights the profound difference between ultimate action and proximate cause.
Oh.
Evolutionary biology might explain the proximate cause of why we feel the visceral urge to reproduce or, to consume high-calorie foods or to hoard resources. The body reservoir provides the impulse, but our advanced cognition dictates the ultimate action.
So we are not perfectly bound to the impulse.
We are not. Consider individuals who dedicate their entire lives to proving abstract mathematical theorems. Or astronauts who subject their bodies to the radiation of space for the sake of scientific discovery.
Neither of which helps them survive on the savannah.
Exactly. These actions provide zero immediate reproductive or survival advantage in the ancestral sense. They are monumental expenditures of energy directed entirely by the cognitive filter. They prove that human trajectory has decoupled from the strict logic of the savannah.
We have self-authorship.
We possess the architecture for profound self-authorship. Yes. But the BRG framework demands that we acknowledge the immense physical and psychological toll that such authorship extracts.
That toll is substantial. And the exhaustion of maintaining that metacognitive override becomes infinitely more dangerous when external technology is actively designed to exploit it.
Dark.
If Evelyn's story shows us the internal friction of utilizing metacognition, what happens when an external system actively works to drain that battery?
We fast forward to today.
Exactly. Let's look at Leo. It is 3:14 a.m. in his apartment in Seattle. The only illumination is the harsh blue glare of his monitor washing over his face. His pulse is thrumming visibly in his throat. He is deeply embedded in a fringe political forum. With every upvote and affirmative comment on his radicalized posts, his brain receives a hit of prehistoric dopamine.
It's tribal validation.
It's visceral, immediate validation from a digital tribe. Now, Leo is highly educated. On a purely intellectual level, his cognitive filter is fully capable of recognizing that the evidence he is consuming and posting is fundamentally flawed. It's structurally cherry-picked by an algorithm optimized for outrage.
But the cognitive filter is being deliberately starved of energy.
Exactly. The ancient instinct to belong to the group is drowning out the logic of the prefrontal cortex. And then the friction event occurs.
Oh, and pushes back.
A stranger in the comment section challenges the factual basis of his post. Instead of triggering a rational spark of debate, the disagreement triggers a massive surge of tribal aggression in Leo.
Which is a very old program.
It's a defensive crouch programmed into his limbic system millennia ago. He responds with vitriol. Afterward, sitting in the blue light, he is filled with a deep private shame at his own irrationality.
The cognitive dissonance.
He is trapped in the chasm between his access to 21st century global data and his primitive need for an us versus them narrative. He is cognitively isolated in a world of infinite connection.
Leo's paralysis is the result of a perfectly engineered evolutionary mismatch. To understand the sheer force of the visceral reaction he is experiencing, we have to look at the timeline of human evolutionary programming. The foundational architecture of the human brain was solidified around 50,000 BC during the hunter-gatherer epoch. In that environment, existence was defined by caloric restriction, constant predator evasion, and strict tribal interdependence.
A tribe of maybe 50 to 150 people.
Correct. In a group that small, facing those brutal environmental pressures, social exclusion was not a psychological inconvenience, it was a literal death sentence.
If you're out, you're dead.
If the tribe expelled you, you starved or were predated upon. The brain evolved to process social rejection using the exact same neural pathways it uses to process physical pain. Then, moving to roughly 10,000 BC, the agricultural revolution introduced the concepts of land ownership, resource storage, and rigid social hierarchies. This cemented a deep scarcity mindset as populations navigated brutal cycles of feast and famine.
And today, we take that deeply paranoid tribal software, which was designed for a world of immediate physical threats and tiny social networks, and we plug it directly into a globalized digital infrastructure.
We've subjected our nervous systems to an environment they were never designed to navigate.
And just to pause here, and it's important to note for you listening, our goal today isn't to take a stance on any specific political ideology or identity politics.
No.
We're strictly looking at the research provided in our sources about how human neurobiology mechanically interacts with digital polarization. Regardless of where an individual falls on the political spectrum, the mechanics of the brain are nonpartisan.
The mechanics are entirely universal. The specific ancient instincts misfiring in Leo's nervous system are tribal belonging, threat hypervigilance, status seeking, and the scarcity mindset.
And the algorithms just feed on that.
Social media algorithms do not care about the content of the belief. They are perfectly optimized to weaponize those specific instincts to maximize engagement. The platforms act as massive automated filter bubbles.
The echo chambers.
They continuously feed the user information that affirms their pre-existing beliefs. This artificially reduces cognitive dissonance, soothing the body reservoir, while simultaneously entrenching extreme, rigid viewpoints.
Let's connect this back to the body reservoir governance model. When Leo is staring at the screen, what is mechanically happening in layer 1?
In the BRG framework, we utilize a concept known as the dynamic sentinel.
The dynamic sentinel.
The body reservoir functions as an intrinsic anomaly detector. It constantly scans the environment and generates a composite discomfort signal, which we map mathematically as the variable d of t.
Okay, d of t.
This signal measures how far the current environment deviates from the habituated baseline. In the ancestral environment of 50,000 BC, if a member of your small tribe suddenly expressed a radically different viewpoint on, say, survival strategy, that was not an intellectual exercise.
It was a threat.
It was a severe anomaly that threatened the cohesive action of the group.
Because a tribe that stops to debate while hunting gets destroyed by the environment.
Yeah.
Cohesion was survival.
When that ancestral anomaly occurred, the dynamic sentinel would spike the D of T signal. This spike forces the metacognitive governor to instantly drop the receptivity parameter alpha down to the floor.
So no more thinking, just reacting.
The brain activates cognitive retaliation and defensive behavior to neutralize the threat and protect the group's consensus. Today, digital algorithms artificially trigger this exact same somatic discomfort signal when they present Leo with a conflicting viewpoint.
The stranger's comment isn't processed as text. It's processed as an existential threat to the tribe.
The stranger's comment causes Leo's internal D of T signal to spike violently. His metacognitive governor registers the discomfort, overrides his calm, rational baseline, and forces him into a state of aggressive retaliation. The social media platform has effectively hacked his dynamic sentinel.
It is the cognitive equivalent of a corrupted feedback loop in an audio system.
So,
well, if you take a microphone and place it too close to the speaker monitor, the system picks up its own ambient noise, feeds it back into the amplification circuit, and endlessly multiplies the same frequency until it becomes a destructive, ear-piercing screech.
That's a very vivid comparison.
The system destroys its own utility. Are these platforms essentially weaponizing the error management theory we discussed earlier? By making social disagreement feel like physical pain, are the algorithms forcing the brain to constantly commit type I errors, perceiving a mortal threat where none exists, simply to keep our nervous systems engaged with the screen?
That is exactly the mechanism of action. The platforms generate revenue by harvesting the attention generated by our threat hypervigilance. And this dynamic introduces one of the most counterintuitive phenomena in cognitive science, which is the sophistication trap.
The sophistication trap?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Leo is highly educated, but his education didn't save him from the feedback loop.
No. The tragedy of modern cognition is that higher intelligence and advanced education are frequently positively correlated with a greater ability to rationalize biased tribal viewpoints.
Having higher intellectual processing power actually makes you worse at identifying your own cognitive biases.
In heavily tribalized environments, yes.
Why?
Because the intellect, the layer 2 cognitive filter, is not being deployed to objectively seek truth. It has been co-opted by the panicked body reservoir to build more elaborate, complex, and sophisticated justifications to remain safely within the digital tribe.
The brilliant mind becomes a defense attorney for the frightened primate.
That is beautifully stated, yes. And if we extrapolate this mechanism to the global stage, the implications are severe. The rampant spread of misinformation during public health crises or democratic elections is not simply a failure of the educational system.
It's a feature, not a bug.
It is a highly successful structural exploitation of our evolutionary hardware. When entire populations become psychologically entrenched in alternate realities to soothe their dynamic sentinels, the shared epistemic baseline required for basic democratic discourse completely disintegrates.
If the population is collectively acting out hijacked limbic responses, objective reality is entirely replaced by whatever narrative neutralizes the amygdala the fastest.
Truth becomes subservient to biological comfort.
Which brings us to the broader consequence of this mismatch between ancient brains and modern systems, and that is complexity collapse.
Complexity collapse is the inevitable result of applying binary evolutionary heuristics to systemic modern crises.
It's the brain just giving up.
The evolutionary shortcuts we developed, the ones that prioritize speed over accuracy, they evolved to favor strict black and white thinking. Friend or foe, light, safe or dangerous.
Very simple categories.
Right. Because of this architectural limitation, human beings struggle immensely to process non-binary, non-linear systemic issues.
We are talking about modern crises, like the slow-moving catastrophe of climate change, the invisible interdependencies of global economics, or the abstract ethical ramifications of artificial intelligence.
These are highly complex systems with delayed feedback loops, but you cannot punch climate change in the face, and you cannot physically run away from inflation.
Right.
The ancient threat detection software cannot parse the data, so it freezes. Or it forces the data into a binary narrative it can understand, usually by assigning a human enemy to the systemic problem.
It reduces a failure of complex systems to a story about bad people doing bad things.
And this reductionist tendency is deeply amplified by what researchers call unjust world beliefs.
What are unjust world beliefs?
Recent psychological research, notably thesis work by Zach Buckner, has explored how individuals perceive ambiguous threats based on their foundational beliefs about the structure of reality.
How does Buckner define it?
It is a core cognitive framework where an individual strongly believes that the world is inherently unfair, consistently dangerous, and fundamentally unpredictable.
A very grim outlook.
Yes. Buckner's research examined how individuals with these strong unjust world beliefs navigate courtship and social interaction. They discovered that these individuals are significantly more likely to commit the error management bias.
How does that manifest in an interaction? Like if someone sends a vaguely worded text message, how does the unjust world belief alter the reception of that text?
When presented with an ambiguous social cue, individuals holding unjust world beliefs are highly prone to projecting extreme motives onto the sender. They are more likely to perceive the other person as being highly sexually motivated, or conversely, as harboring inherent aggressive intent.
If your baseline assumption is that the world is a dangerous, exploitative place, you project extreme binary motives onto everyone around you as a preemptive defense mechanism.
It functions entirely as a self-handicapping or self-protection strategy. If the world is unjust, you cannot afford to trust subtlety.
You're always on guard.
You systematically overperceive the threat because your internal calculus dictates that the cost of a false, negative failing to see a predator that is actually there is catastrophic. You view every interaction through the lens of potential exploitation.
I want to tie this back to the mathematical model of the BRG framework, specifically the concept of interoceptive prediction error. In that model, the D of T discomfort signal spikes when there's a discrepancy between the body's current state and its baseline expectations. If the modern world is fundamentally hyper-complex, completely unpredictable, and the digital infrastructure is constantly pumping negative, out-of-context anomalies into our nervous systems every time we look at our phones, doesn't that mean our bodies are locked in a perpetual state of high-alert discomfort?
It certainly points to that.
I have to ask, is the current unprecedented global mental health crisis simply the physical manifestation of 300,000-year-old threat detection software physically short-circuiting, because it cannot process abstract, non-physical threats like financial volatility or digital social isolation.
It is highly probable from a neurobiological standpoint that a massive portion of our collective modern anxiety stems from exactly that mechanical failure. The modern outrage industry and the political polarization engines, they rely entirely on this biological inability to process continuous interoceptive prediction error.
They profit from the short circuit.
When presented with a complex, nuanced truth, the psychological discomfort, the heat of the KL divergence, drives humans back into the soothing, simplistic arms of evolutionary narratives.
Our ancient cheater detection mechanisms, which evolved to spot free riders in the small 50-person tribe, are suddenly misfiring in a globalized society of 8 billion people.
We begin seeing exploitation, conspiracies, and intentional malice everywhere, fueled by a relentless, algorithmic news cycle that functions as a continuous, never-ending predator warning. The body is completely exhausted, the dynamic sentinel is screaming continuously, and the cognitive filter is drained of the energy required to mute the alarm.
So we have accurately diagnosed the machinery. We are metabolically exhausted, our biological heuristics are being hijacked by algorithmic feedback loops, and we are retreating into complexity collapse because the modern world is too loud.
The diagnosis is clear.
How do we engineer a way out? How do we rewire the loop?
The required shift is monumental. We must move away from biological determinism, the fatalistic belief that we are just meat machines running outdated software, and move toward conscious, deliberate societal engineering. We have to adopt a rigorous framework of radical intellectual humility.
Radical intellectual humility. That sounds excellent in a philosophy seminar, but what are the actual mechanics of applying that to nervous system under siege?
It requires treating your own deep-seated convictions, especially the ones that feel most visceral and defensive, as hypotheses to be stress-tested, rather than as core identities to be defended to the death.
That's a hard shift to make.
The research outlines 3 specific, actionable frameworks for navigating modern information environments. The first is analytical decoupling.
What does it mean to analytically decouple?
This is the deliberate practice of recognizing when a piece of information, a headline, a social media post, a political speech, is specifically engineered to trigger your tribal instinct.
Seeing the strings being pulled.
Exactly. It is the awareness of your own spiking D of T signal. When you feel the outrage or the fear, you intentionally pause to engage the prefrontal cortex. You decouple the emotional limbic trigger from the cognitive response. You force the alpha parameter down manually, taking control before the body reservoir reacts automatically.
It is recognizing the bait and actively refusing to let the jaw snap shut. What is the second framework?
The second is falsification exercises. This is often referred to in logic circles as steel manning.
Steel manning, right. The opposite of straw manning.
Right. It requires actively seeking out the strongest, most articulate possible version of an argument that opposes your own belief. Instead of constantly seeking confirmation to soothe the body reservoir, you intentionally test the structural integrity of your internal beliefs by trying to prove them wrong.
It is the direct mechanical antidote to confirmation bias.
Yeah, a third.
Algorithmic awareness. This is a structural understanding of the literal design of the digital environments you inhabit. It means recognizing that filter bubbles are not natural occurrences. They are engineered architectures.
They are built to trap you.
You must actively and intentionally diversify your information diet to break the feedback loop of the algorithm, forcing your brain to process diverse data points even when it is uncomfortable.
How does radical intellectual humility map back to the mathematics of the body reservoir governance model? Is there an optimal numerical setting for navigating the modern world? The numerical simulations in the BRG framework provide a very clear answer to that. The data shows that optimal governance, the state that maximizes the organism's payoff while minimizing the brutal thermodynamic complexity cost, does not occur at an alpha of 1.
Because at alpha 1, you are a slave to blind habit and algorithmic manipulation.
Exactly.
But it also doesn't occur at an alpha 0, right? We already established that pure cognitive override burns out the battery.
The optimal metacognitive receptivity is an interior point, usually resting around 0.6 to 0.7. Radical intellectual humility is the real-world application of finding and holding this mathematical balance. You trust your bodily intuitions for basic daily navigation, which keeps your thermodynamic costs manageable. But you maintain the dynamic sentinel readiness to sharply, immediately intervene with layer 2 cognitive override the moment you detect a tribal manipulation or a simplistic binary narrative.
It makes me think of the division of labor in an aircraft cockpit. The biological hardware is the autopilot system. It is incredibly efficient for clear skies and predictable physics. It saves the pilot's metabolic energy for when it is truly needed. But navigating the modern digital age is like flying an aircraft through a Category 5 hurricane. If you leave the system on autopilot while flying into a hurricane, the rigid programming will guarantee a catastrophic crash. You have to take manual control of the yoke.
You have to fly the plane.
But I have to push back on the practicality of this solution. We just spent an hour detailing how the thermodynamic cost of overriding the limbic system is physically exhausting. Can society reasonably expect the average citizen, who is already dealing with economic pressure and modern anxiety, to constantly perform analytical decoupling? Can't we really expect 8 billion people to fly manual in a hurricane all the time?
That is the most pressing existential challenge of our time. If human beings are inherently susceptible to these biases, and if overriding them is metabolically expensive, then we absolutely cannot rely solely on individual willpower.
Because the battery will fail.
The battery will fail. This realization points directly to the necessary future of institutional design. Our institutions must be re-engineered to act as external cognitive filters.
External cognitive filters. We need to build guardrails into the environment to protect our biology from itself.
We need to design environments, digital platforms, educational curricula, civic forums, and legal frameworks that inherently reduce the thermodynamic burden on the individual.
Taking the pressure off layer 2.
We need structural architectures that automatically reward intellectual humility, curiosity, and nuance, rather than algorithmic structures that incentivize and monetize tribal allegiance and limbic outrage. We must engineer the external environment to support our internal metacognition, because the ancient biology simply cannot bear the load alone.
So tracing the architecture of this entire deep dive, we started by looking at Dr. Julian Vann in 1984, tasting the bitter realization that his hardwired biological theory of sexual overperception was actually just the invisible constructed walls of his own suburban culture.
Right.
We examined Evelyn in 1968, experiencing the literal thermodynamic friction of using her metacognitive filter to defy millions of years of reproductive logic for an abstract ethical stance.
The cost of free will.
And we analyzed Leo, trapped in the blue light of a digital echo chamber, having his ancient tribal survival instincts weaponized by algorithms designed to harvest his outrage.
The through line connecting all of these distinct mechanisms is the profound realization that while human biology is the undeniable foundation of our behavioral reality, it is a drastically insufficient blueprint for navigating the complexities of modern civilization.
It's just not enough anymore.
The confirmation bias trap, the rapid spike of the dynamic sentinel, the retreat into unjust world beliefs. These are remnants of a survival system that prioritized immediate speed over objective accuracy. It kept the species alive on the savanna. But the modern world demands nuance, systemic comprehension, and a high tolerance for cognitive dissonance that our evolutionary hardware simply cannot provide without massive, deliberate intervention.
We have built a civilization that fundamentally requires us to be better than our original programming. And perhaps that is the ultimate evolutionary advantage of the human species. It isn't an innate ability to perfectly seamlessly adapt to a static environment. It is the profound, friction-filled, metabolically exhausting capacity to deliberately render our own evolutionary adaptations obsolete.